For nearly 3 weeks, Russian T-80 tank columns kept pushing toward Ukrainian positions east of Kupyansk. Then, almost overnight, the heavy armor stopped moving forward. The tracks went quiet. The smoke columns from burning tanks faded from the daily footage, and the assaults that followed used mostly small infantry groups, light buggies, and motorcycles instead. On the surface, this looks like a short pause for resupply. In reality, it may be one of the clearest signs yet that a key Russian armored formation has reached its breaking point on this part of the front. More than 40 T-80 variants are believed to have been lost in the area in a short window, many of them to drones, mines, and precision strikes before they ever reached the first Ukrainian trench line. The real shock is not the number of tanks lost. The real shock is how quickly the loss happened and what it may mean for every army that still builds its plans around heavy armor. The Kupyansk axis is not just another section of the front. It sits at the gateway to northern Donbass, and it is one of the few places where Russian commanders still try to use full tank platoons in classic assault roles. If those platoons can no longer move, the entire idea of using main battle tanks as a spearhead in this war comes under pressure. That assumption is now under pressure across the whole front line, and what is happening near Kupyansk is shaping how planners think about armor on both sides. So, what really stopped the T-80s on this axis? Was it a sudden change in Ukrainian tactics, or the slow accumulation of small losses that finally crossed a line? And why did a tank built for speed and shock collapse so completely against units that, on paper, look much lighter than the force in front of them? The Kupyansk axis runs east of the Oskil River in northeastern Ukraine. For more than a year, Russian forces have tried to push back toward the town of Kupyansk itself, hoping to reverse the gains Ukraine made there in the autumn of 2022. The terrain is mixed. There are open fields and farm tracks that look like good ground for armor. But there are also tree lines, small villages, and gentle hills that work in favor of the defender. In this kind of country, a tank can either be a hammer or a target, depending on how it is used. And for most of the past year, Russian planners tried to use the T-80 as a hammer here. The T-80 is one of the older main battle tanks in the Russian inventory, but it is also one of the fastest. It uses a gas turbine engine, similar in concept to the engine in a helicopter, which gives it strong acceleration and a higher top speed than the more common T-72 and T-90 variants. On flat ground, a T-80 can cover open fields quickly, push through gaps in the line, and reach defensive positions before a defender can fully react. That is exactly the kind of role Russian command tried to assign to it on the Kupyansk axis. The plan was simple. Small groups of T-80s, sometimes with infantry mounted on the back or following in light vehicles, would race across open fields toward Ukrainian fortified positions. Behind them, more infantry would move up to secure the gains. The idea was speed. The idea was shock. The idea was to give Ukrainian drone operators and anti-tank teams as little time as possible to react. In the past, this method worked, at least partially. There were sectors where T-80 groups pushed through screen lines, forced Ukrainian withdrawals, and gained a few kilometers in a day. But that was a different battlefield. That was a battlefield with fewer drones, fewer cameras in the sky, and fewer pre-mapped kill zones. The pattern on this battlefield is clear. The same tactic that worked 1 year ago does not work today. And the place where this change is most visible may be the Kupyansk axis. In the early weeks of the latest push, the T-80 groups still moved with confidence. Reconnaissance drones were sent ahead to mark Ukrainian positions. Electronic warfare vehicles, which try to jam the radio signals used by small drones, drove behind the lead armor. Mortars and artillery prepared a barrage on suspected anti-tank teams. From a distance, it looked like a textbook combined arms attack. But every step of the movement was seen, measured, and turned into a target. Ukrainian observation drones, flying high above the line, watched the columns assemble in the rear. They watched the fuel trucks arrive. They watched the engineers clear paths through known minefields. They watched the T-80s line up in tree lines just before the assault. By the time the first tank rolled into the open, the Ukrainian side already had a model of the attack in their hands. They knew the route. They knew the timing. They knew which vehicle in the column carried the jammer. From that position, the structure of the unit became easier to interpret, and once it was understood, it could be taken apart in a clear order. The first hits did not always come from the front. They often came from the flanks, from drones launched out of small wooded positions kilometers to the side of the route. These were not large attack aircraft. They were cheap quadcopters and fixed-wing strike drones, many of them costing less than a single tank shell. But in numbers, and aimed correctly, they were enough to halt a heavy column. Because of that, the decision on the Ukrainian side was made early. The first target was not the lead tank. The first target was the electronic warfare vehicle. With the jammer gone, the protective bubble around the column collapsed. Suddenly, every drone in the area could lock onto its target without interference. The lead tank, expecting to dictate the pace of the battle, became the slowest object on the field, and the tanks behind it, still in column on a narrow track, had nowhere to spread out. They could not turn around quickly. They could not push forward through their own burning lead vehicle. They had to choose between staying in place and being hit, or trying to reverse under fire. Both choices were bad. That is when the assault stopped being an assault. It became a recovery operation under attack. One engagement near a small settlement east of Kupyansk shows the pattern almost in textbook form. A reinforced Russian assault group built around 4 T-80 tanks, 2 armored personnel carriers, and a handful of light vehicles, prepared to move on a Ukrainian strongpoint at first light. The plan looked solid on the map. The route used a low ridge to mask the initial movement. The timing matched a planned artillery barrage. A small drone team in the rear was tasked with checking the road ahead for fresh mines. The first sign of trouble came not from the front, but from above. A Ukrainian fixed-wing observation drone, flying high enough to be hard to spot from the ground, had already locked onto the staging area. It tracked the column as it left cover. It counted the vehicles. It noted the position of the jammer vehicle in the middle of the formation. That information was passed in near real time to a strike cell several kilometers behind the Ukrainian line. From that moment, the column was no longer hidden. It was simply being watched, very patiently. The first strike was small, a single FPV drone, the kind that pilots fly using a video feed and goggles, came in low along a tree line. It did not go for the lead tank. It went for the electronic warfare truck near the middle of the column. The hit was clean. The jamming bubble dropped. Within a minute, 3 more FPV drones came in, this time targeting the lead T-80 and the rear T-80, the 2 vehicles that controlled the speed and direction of the entire group. The lead tank was struck on the upper turret in a known weak spot above the engine bay. The rear tank was struck on the engine deck. Both began to burn. With the column now stopped on a narrow track, the remaining vehicles tried to maneuver. One of the armored personnel carriers attempted to push past the burning lead tank by moving into the open field. It hit a small anti-tank mine within seconds. The crew survived, but the vehicle was finished. The second T-80 in the column tried to reverse, but the rear T-80 was already in flames behind it. There was no way out. From that point, the work for the drone operators became almost routine. One by one, the surviving vehicles were picked off. Crews tried to escape on foot, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The entire engagement, from the first strike on the jammer to the destruction of the last tank, lasted less than 20 minutes. That is the speed of the modern battlefield, and it explains, more than any single number, why Russian commanders may have begun to pull T-80 groups back from the most exposed routes on this axis. To understand why this kind of engagement is now possible, it helps to look at what has changed in the air above the Kupyansk axis. In the past, a tank advancing across open ground worried mostly about a small set of threats: anti-tank missile teams, hidden mines, enemy tanks waiting in ambush positions. All of those threats still exist. But they are now joined by a new layer that did not exist on this scale even 2 years ago. That layer is made of small, cheap, mass-produced drones. Some are quadcopters carrying a single grenade or a shaped charge. Some are fixed-wing strike drones that can fly tens of kilometers and dive onto a target. Some are wire-guided drones that cannot be jammed at all because they trail a thin fiber optic cable behind them and send video through it. This last type is the one that has changed the balance the most. A jammer can defeat radio-controlled drones. A jammer cannot defeat a drone that does not use radio. And once fiber optic drones became common on this axis, the protective bubble that the T-80 columns relied on began to lose its meaning. At the same time, the density of minefields along likely advance routes has grown. Engineers from both sides have been laying mines, often dropped from drones, for many months. The result is that almost every road, track, and field that armor might use is now suspected to contain something hidden in the dirt. A T-80 trying to cross such a field has to either stop and check, which gives drones time to strike, or push through and hope, which gives mines the chance to do their work. Armored vehicles bring firepower, but they are easier to track. Light vehicles move faster, but they leave soldiers exposed. And tanks, in the middle of this picture, are now caught in the worst of both worlds. They are not fast enough to outrun the drones. They are not small enough to hide. They are not light enough to cross all terrain. They are not heavy enough to ignore the new generation of warheads designed to attack from above. A soldier leaving cover can reveal a route. A supply vehicle can reveal a delivery point. And an effort to defend that route can expose air defense assets that the drones above are already searching for. The result is a layered trap that does not require a single dramatic weapon. It requires patience, cheap tools, and good observation. That combination has now matured, and the T-80, designed in a very different era, is having a very hard time inside it. There is also a hardware story behind the pause. The T-80 family is not a single tank. It includes several variants, from older models with limited armor upgrades to newer versions with reactive armor blocks and improved fire control. But all of them share certain features that matter on this battlefield. The gas turbine engine, while powerful, drinks fuel at a high rate compared to a diesel engine of similar size. That means a T-80 unit needs more frequent resupply, which means more fuel trucks moving through areas where drones are watching. Every fuel run is a small risk. Over weeks, those small risks add up. The T-80 also has a relatively exposed upper turret area, which is the part of the tank that drones love to attack. Modern FPV and top attack drones aim for the thin armor above the engine and the crew compartment, not the thick armor at the front. Cope cages, the makeshift bar structures welded over the turret, can help against some drones, but they are not a full solution. And the larger and more visible the cage, the more obvious the tank becomes from above. Replacement is another problem. Russia has been producing new tanks and pulling older ones from long-term storage for years now. But the T-80 is harder to restore than some other types because the gas turbine engine is more specialized to maintain. In several documented cases, T-80s pulled from storage have appeared at the front in worse condition than expected, with limited optics, missing reactive armor blocks, or older fire control systems. That makes them even more vulnerable in the kind of environment described above. And once you lose more than a certain percentage of a tank battalion in a short time, you are not just losing vehicles, you are losing trained crews, experienced mechanics, and the small group of officers who know how to coordinate armor with infantry and artillery. Those losses do not show up clearly in a single video. They show up in the slow collapse of an offensive that just weeks earlier looked like it might break through. That is why the sudden quiet on parts of the Kupyansk axis matters. It is not silence by choice, it is silence by exhaustion. And it suggests that the leadership on the Russian side has, for now, decided to shift its weight to lighter, cheaper, more disposable units. Motorcycles, buggies, small infantry assault groups. They are easier to replace. But they are also far less capable of holding ground once they reach it. That trade-off is now visible across the entire axis. The pause in T-80 movement does not mean the Kupyansk axis has gone quiet. It means the shape of the fighting has changed. Russian command appears to be testing several adjustments at the same time, looking for any combination that might restore movement. One change is the use of armor in much smaller groups. Instead of a platoon of 4 tanks rolling forward together, single T-80s have been observed moving alone, hugging tree lines, advancing only a few hundred meters at a time before pulling back. The logic is that a single tank is a smaller signature, harder to spot, and easier to extract if something goes wrong. The cost is that a single tank cannot hold ground on its own. Another change is the increased use of infantry on motorcycles and quad bikes, racing ahead of the armor instead of behind it. The idea is to force Ukrainian drone teams to spend their munitions on fast, cheap targets, leaving fewer drones available when the heavier armor finally appears. In some cases, this method has succeeded in pushing small infantry groups close to Ukrainian positions. In many other cases, the motorcycles have been destroyed before reaching the line, and the armor behind them has still not been able to move forward safely. On the Ukrainian side, the response has been to expand drone teams, deepen the layered network of observation, and push more fiber-optic strike drones into the front lines. New crews are being trained quickly, and units that specialize in counter-armor strikes are getting priority on the latest equipment. The result is a quiet kind of arms race in which each side adjusts its tools and tactics on a near-weekly basis. The pattern on this battlefield is clear. The side that adapts faster gains ground. The side that does not falls back. And right now, on this axis, the side under pressure to adapt is the side that built its entire offensive plan around heavy armor. This points to a deeper shift on today's battlefield, and it goes well beyond a single Russian tank model on a single axis in northeastern Ukraine. For most of the last 70 years, the main battle tank has been the central symbol of land power. Armies were measured by how many they had. Doctrines were built around how to use them in mass. Entire defense industries were structured around producing them, upgrading them, and selling them abroad. The idea was that a heavy, mobile, well-armored platform with a big gun could break through any defense if used in enough numbers and with enough support. That idea is not dead, but it is being tested in ways it has never been tested before. What the Kupyansk axis shows is that even a tank designed for speed and shock can be brought to a complete halt by tools that in cash terms cost less than the optics on its own turret. A few $1,000s of drone, paired with a few $100s of mine, paired with a careful observation network, is enough to turn an open field into a place where main battle tanks simply cannot survive. This is no longer just a story about Russia and Ukraine. It is becoming a preview of what every armored force in the world will have to plan for. The implications stretch far. Countries that have invested heavily in large tank fleets are now studying these engagements very closely. Countries that have built lighter, more dispersed forces are watching to see if their bet has paid off. Defense industries are racing to design active protection systems that can shoot incoming drones out of the sky, new armor packages aimed at top attack threats, and new electronic warfare gear that can defeat fiber-optic drones in some way. None of these solutions are mature yet, and until they are, the tank, in its current form, is operating in a much smaller comfort zone than its designers ever imagined. The real shock is not that T-80 tanks are stopping near Kupyansk. The real shock is that the era in which any heavy armor could move freely in daylight on open ground may be quietly ending. And the people who notice that first will be the ones who shape the wars that follow. The cold lesson from this stretch of the Kupyansk axis is simple. Speed no longer protects armor. Shock no longer breaks a defense built on cheap, layered observation. And the tank, for all its history and all its weight of legend, is now just one node in a network that can be picked apart in minutes by tools that fit in the back of a small van. That is the new reality on this front, and it is not going away. So, what comes next on the Kupyansk axis? Will Russian command find a working answer, perhaps through new active protection systems, new electronic warfare gear, or new tactics that finally restore some freedom of movement to heavy armor? Or will the T-80 and the doctrine built around it quietly fade from this part of the front as lighter, cheaper, more disposable units take over the assault role for good? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this analysis was useful, like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more clear coverage on the weapons, battles, and politics shaping today's war.